All right, guys, in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about shading. And so that you know what we're working on, this is the overlays on a bridle bit, like you would ride a horse with, for those of y'all that don't know. And it's got a loud little cricket right there. But for the purpose of this video, I've done some of it already so that we can kind of see what we're shooting for. So when you put silver on this, it's cut out of silver and then it's soldered onto the side of the bit cheek. And whenever you go back, you want to be able to bevel those edges and put the shading cuts in there, and in an attempt to make it look pretty nice. And this is what we would call done engraving, and you can see the different values of shading and whatnot. This area right here has only been beveled. In other words, it all looks like this, and then you go back around and bevel the edges, and it gives a little bit of dimension. And then the next step on this portion right here would be to actually add in the shading lines. So let me change cameras so that we can get a little bit closer look. And let's talk about beveling those edges, which would be your first step. So you've soldered the thing to your piece, your belt buckle, your bit, whatever it was you happen to be working on. And now what you've got is a lot of straight edges, very crisp edges. These side walls right here are really square. So traditionally, guys would go around and they would bevel this with a flat graver. And we put that in there, not upside down. You would you're trying to cut a bevel or an angle on the side of this, just to give it a little bit of dimension, make it look a little bit more 3D, a little bit cleaner. I don't do it that way anymore because whenever they came up with what's called a parallel heel graver, if you can see those heels on that, what that essentially does is when you're engraving with this, when you're cutting with this graver, you've got a flat graver on both sides of the tool. And it does take a little bit of practice. I'm not going to mislead you. It's definitely a feel thing, and it takes a minute to get used to feeling it. I'm going to try to dim this down just a hair. It does take a minute to get used to feeling of this because you're actually, instead of cutting on the tip of the graver, you're going to be hanging the tip of it off of the edge and cutting on the side. And what that causes you to need to do is to push a little bit against that overlay. So as I go to engrave this, you can see my tips hanging off of the edge, and I'm putting pressure on the side of that overlay so that I can get this bevel cut. And normally what that does for you is it allows you to cut those without making very many of these little infractions right there. You can see where that doesn't look so great because you could call that heel drag. There's a couple of different things that you could call that. But what you want is to not have that. So it's a good idea to have a burnishing tool sitting around whenever you're beveling those edges. And this is basically just a sharpened and polished piece of carbide. And I can rub it back and forth where I've made that ugly spot, and I can get rid of that pretty quickly and get it cleaned up. So in the interest of beveling, you can also see that you're going to need to cut those main lines, and I've got them scribed in here. You can kind of see them, and you would go around cut all of your main lines. Now in a situation like this, we're coming up on the edge. In other words, I'm cutting this line and it's going to go off of the edge so that I can get this area out here. And what you want to practice doing is just go straight off of the edge. And you can see where the graver tip is pointed. I'm not going to follow that edge with the graver tip. I'm going to let the tip hang off of the edge, and then I'm just going to bevel that. Again, we're cutting on the side or what would be the heel of the graver. And same situation here. I'll start inside the cut that I already made. And as I get to the edge, I want to hang that graver off the edge to cut that bevel. I think that if you'll get through the learning curve of that, you'll find this a lot easier and cleaner to control than using a flat graver for everything. Now, there's going to be places where the flat graver makes more sense in these big, long runs like this. But when you're trying to work in pretty tight quarters right here, I think you'll find that the V graver is a much better tool for beveling. Now, the way this is drawn, this whole scroll element right here is actually in front of this. So anything that's foreground, you want to go ahead and cut that first. And again, I'm cutting where my line needs to be, and then once I get off of the edge, we're going to be cutting on the side of that heel. And these little small areas are definitely trickier than bigger areas, especially on something like a bridle bit where as I'm coming around, my handpiece is trying to bump into the ball hinge of this bit. So I'm having to be careful of that. And that would be your first step after you have soldered down an overlay to something, be it a buckle or, whatever the heck you were working on. You're going to go around, reestablish all of your main cut lines, bevel your edges, and then you're going to be ready to do shading. Now, because of the obstacles that may or may not be in your way, it may make sense to cut some things backwards. If you've watched any of the drawing videos on my Patreon page or anything like that, you'll know that I'm pretty strong advocate for cutting things in the direction that they grow. But sometimes that's just not realistic. Because you have obstacles in the way, especially when you're building bits and spurs. And, in some cases, the belt buckle may have some big casting soldered on there. So when you're beveling your edges, you may have to be creative and come at it from a couple different directions. And if I had something to help you do that, if you're going to make a break in a line, leave it out somewhere where you've got good access to it so that you can come in from the other side. You can come in from the other side and overcut. In other words, don't just cut up to where that cut was. Go ahead and continue cutting a little way past that, and that'll give you the ability to kind of blend those two cuts together, and there won't be a crisp separation where there was a start and a stop. And as you're engraving it, don't get discouraged. Sometimes whenever you're looking at an overlay, you'll feel like it's a little bit rough or it looks a little chopped up. But the reality of it is we're looking at this at a very high magnification. And your intended viewing distance, where you're just looking at this thing on the side of an object, you want to be as clean as you can be. That's not a green light to do crappy work. Just realize that there is a human factor that's going to have to be dealt with, and the more you do it, naturally, the cleaner and more efficient you'll be able to get at it. So you can see that this process does take a little bit of time. So just working our way around, cutting the main lines, and then drifting to a bevel cut on all of the outside pieces of the element. And you're just going to have to practice that. That's a feel thing. And then once you've got your beveling done, you would be ready to shade. So we're going to go back down to this portion of it. And you can see that this is already beveled and it's okay. And we want to talk about the shade line. So when you're new to shading, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking because you don't want to actually make a cut only to realize in 5 minutes, oh crap, I wish I wouldn't have made that cut there. So one of the cool things that you can do is, this is just a mechanical pencil. It's the one that takes the 0.5 millimeter to 0.5 on the mechanical pencil. And this is a polished sewing needle that I ground the head off of. And it will fit inside of a mechanical pencil and retract and everything, just like the lead. What it'll allow you to do is draw small enough that you could kind of think your way through your shade line before you actually cut them. You'll get to the point where you're not going to take the time to do this. You're just going to grip it and rip it. But when you're early on, or you're working on a project that has that, as we call, the pucker factor, you can kind of think your way through the shading using one of these tools pretty easy, because it'll scribe a line as small as a shade line. So usually when you're going to shade a leaf, let's take this little leaf element right here, for example. Anywhere that there's a lobe or anything, at the base of that lobe, I want you to imagine that there's an imaginary growth line that follows all the way back down to the base of it, where all of this grew from. So everything grows from seed to sun, or in an upward direction. And you break that into two panels when you imagine that line. So you've got one panel here, one panel here. And you're going to shade those panels independently of each other. So shade lines would belong to the line beneath them. So if you can imagine that this curve right here, imagine if there were a series of wires that just kind of frayed up from that curve, and that's going to be as good a way as any to remember which direction that you should be shading. And if you want to put a fold over in it, which we probably will, then you're just going to come in from the edge a little bit to show that it had some sort of a thickness when you folded it. And we're just going to mimic this line right here. And when you put a fold over in, you want to shade your fold overs first, and you're always going to be cutting towards the shadow or towards the darkness, because the natural tendency of a V-shaped graver is to cut from thin to thick. And we'll put another little fold over right here, and then we'll shade this direction here. Okay, that's plain and simple enough. Take this little leaf lobe or this bud coming off of the back. To make that look a little bit fancier and not so simple, we'll put a fold over in it on this as well. And to do that, here's your edge. We're going to come in from the edge just a little bit to show that there was a thickness when it got folded. And we're just going to mimic the shape of that line. And then this would shade into the fold over. And then these shade lines would run right back down the bottom. So that's not very exciting. It'll be much more exciting to actually watch this happen. So let's start with this little bud. So I'm out on the edge. I'm going to come over just a little bit to show that there's a thickness. And just mimic that line. Doesn't look like much yet, but it will progressively get better and better. So I want to shade into the darkness, or into the shadow that this fold over or this awning would have created on that leaf. So going very light and getting a little bit more aggressive as I get towards the end of it. It starts to give the effect of that's a little bit darker there at the fold over. Then our growth shading, which are the shading or the veins that go back. They're trying to make their way all the way back to the seed of where this grew from. And that's all it takes to shade that little leaf. You can cross-hatch that or do some other things to it. Trying to keep it fairly simple for this video. But here we go with this one. First comes the fold overs. And as luck would have it, this big ball bearing is right in my way, and I can't get my graver there. So I'm going to be forced to cut this backwards. And this is going to happen to you a lot, so you might as well just practice cutting backwards a little bit. Hopefully you don't have to do it much, but there are going to be times. So I'm just going to start in and try to not dig the china and put a little fold over cut there. And then shade lines would go towards the fold over. And you want to stagger them. Don't let the tips of your lines be even. You know, one short, one long, one short. It'll make it look a little bit more natural. It won't look so CNC or mechanical. And then here, everything's so small. It's such tight quarters right there that maybe we're not going to bother cutting a hard line to make that fold over, but we're going to try to give it the illusion of a fold over by, we're going to cut a cut. We'll bring another cut in there, And where all of these cuts merge together, it's going to end up leaving a smooth high point right there in the peak of that leaf. That's going to give us the illusion of some depth. And then your shading lines are always going to follow the growth pattern or traipse back towards the bottom where everything grew from. And we're going to go, oops, I slipped. We're going to go from shallow to gradually deeper. And then we'll change up our length a little bit, and we're going to go light to gradually deeper. And where this imaginary growth line was at the point of that leaf, where this imaginary line was, no shade lines go there. That will end up being a highlight in your leaf. So where we would be tempted to put the next shade line right here, we're not going to. We're going to skip that space and leave it blank. And as subtle as that seems, in the finished engraving, that's going to leave a highlight in that leaf, and it's going to make it look like this is a little bit higher and everything shaded. If you choose to crosshatch, and you're certainly not required to, the theory is this. Your crosshatch lines would be deeper and closer together at the base, and then they're going to get gentler or shallower, if you will, and a little bit further apart as you go up. So you have a crosshatch, crosshatch, crosshatch. Now I'm getting gentler and further apart as we go up that leaf, and then it starts to give you that effect. Now, how good this looks while you're engraving, it does certainly depend on the material that you're engraving in. Obviously, the steel that's in the slide of a pistol or something like that is going to allow you to make finer, cleaner shade lines than cutting in silver, just because of the metal won't be stretching. You know, copper and silver and things like that have a tendency to start stretching out. But you can kind of get the idea of the effect that that's going to have as you're shading. And whenever you combine all of that together on a series, then it starts to look pretty nice. And I tried to keep it pretty simple, tried to keep this video short enough so that on YouTube, one might not lose, attention. But there's the idea of it, and as you look at it really, really close, you can certainly see the humanity in them cuts, where there's certainly a lack of perfection. You're going for perfection, but you're not always going to get it. And I'm trying to switch over to the other camera. When you look at that from a distance that would be viewed without magnification in the hand, a lot of that humanity factor starts disappearing, and you're getting the effect and the values that you're wanting to take something that's two-dimensional and start giving it some 3D illusions. So anyway, I hope that helped. Hope it was enough to pique your interest. If you're aspiring to be a hand engraver, then check out the Patreon page. There's most of the videos on there are an hour and a half to 2 hours long, and there's quite a few of them, and they're kind of a deep dive into some of this stuff. And I'll try to post the videos, try to keep them to 10 and 15 minutes and throw some tips and tricks in there to kind of spark some interest so that hand engraving stays, kind of something that people do. So thank you guys, and good luck.